Hi everybody. So if you're watching this video, that means you have just watched or previously watched chapter 1, lecture 1, where we were going over the history of psychology, the different branches of psychology, and we talked a little bit about misinformation and using critical thinking to be able to uh, engage with information in a way that doesn't have us believing untruths. Now we're going into part 2 of chapter 1, where we're going to be talking about the scientific method. And that's going to be double check. Yeah, most of all of this chapter. And we're going to touch a little bit on ethics as well. And if you're following along in the handouts, this is going to be slide 20. And the first title is going to be scientific method. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to make this large, if I can find the thing. There we go. Okay, so we're going to hop right into scientific method. So you might be a little bit familiar with scientific method in your previous science classes, but this is going to go a little bit more in depth, sort of like a college academic level of the scientific method. So psychologists support scientific attitudes with the scientific method, right? It is used in all of our psychological research. So some key terms we need to make sure we know as we're going through this are theory, hypothesis, operational definition, replication, meta-analysis, case study, naturalistic observation, and survey. So we're going to go over, as we go through the slides, what each of these things are, right? But brief definitions, a theory is just a idea of how certain things happen in the universe, right? We have like the theory of gravity, right? Which we call the law of gravity, but the thing about science, right, the scientific method, is that nothing is ever proven, right? Nothing is ever fully fact. For it to be science, it has to be able to have the option, right, the possibility to be disproven. Um, Gravity, right, has we call it a law because there's been so much research done that supports gravity that in all actuality, it is accurate. But there is always a possibility that some new information could come out that disproves it. So we have theories, we don't necessarily have full on, this is the thing, because it could always be disproven. We have hypotheses, which are testable predictions, right? Theories can be a little more general, but when you're trying to work through a study, you want to have your hypothesis as testable as possible. If you can't test it, you can't do any scientific research with it. We have operational definitions, so it's how you are defining something. Sometimes in psychological research, we are working with abstract concepts like happiness, love, fear, right? And those are very general, very abstract. We have to define them. So we have to give them an operational definition in our studies. We also have replication. So another key component of scientific research is that it has to be able to be replicated. If you have a study and it's a good study and you find this certain finding, but no one else can replicate the study you did, your results are not valid because it's not replicable. We have meta-analyses. So meta-analysis is where you take all the scientific research or all the research articles that have been done on a particular topic. You combine all of the data and the analyses that were found and conducted, and you sort of make a average of what all of these studies are finding. So if, say we were looking for all of the research done on positive reinforcement in kids age 3 to 5, we're going to go look for all of those articles. We're going to take all of the analyses that they've done and we're going to average them together to get like a general results. Then we have case studies where if something happens that say is impossible or unethical to replicate. We can study, right, a case study, an individual occurrence of something happening. And we derive theories and hypotheses from this case study. A really good case study that I'll probably mention a few times is Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker, I believe in the early 1900s or the late 1800s. And he unfortunately was in a work accident and had a traumatic brain injury where a railroad spike went through his skull and obliterated his frontal cortex, right? So the frontal lobe up here. And he survived, which was fascinating to begin with. But it's a really interesting case study because Phineas Gage's personality changed entirely after his brain injury. And it is through that case study and some following case studies and scientific studies done that we've realized that a lot of the personality of a person, along with like a lot of their emotion regulation and their decision making, is found in their frontal lobe. So before Phineas had his brain injury, he was this very kind, caring, considerate man. He wasn't a smoker. He was like a family man. And then after his brain injury, he became very rude, crass, irritable. He developed I believe it was he started gambling and he started smoking. So we saw this complete 180 in his personality. And a lot of that had to do with most of that had to do with his brain injury, destroying his frontal lobe. So case studies are fascinating because they let us see what would happen in an instance where we could not ethically create those circumstances. We have also naturalistic observation, and this is like where you just sit and watch. So people watching, if you go to a store or a coffee shop and you just sit and watch people, you're participating in naturalistic observation. You're seeing kind of what's happening. Then you also have survey research. So I mentioned previously, my background is, my current job is in market research. So I do research on a toy brand, and all of our study is conducted through survey. So we are drawing information from people through their responses in a survey. So useful theories, right? We organize our observations, we imply predictions that anyone can use to check theory and to derive practical applications. We may stimulate further research that leads to a revised theory, right? Because remember I said that theories, right, can always change because science does not prove anything. It just supports or does not support. So as we're going through creating theories, we're gathering observations, we're making our studies replicable so other people can check and see if that theory is accurate or if it is not supported and it's another theory or it's a modified theory that is more supported by research. So this is just an example, right? We have a theory right here, sleep boosts memory. And this theory leads to our hypothesis. The example, when sleep deprived, people remember less from the day before. Okay, and this hypothesis leads to research and observations, gives study material to people before A, an ample night's sleep, and B, a shortened night's sleep, and then test memory. So we have our two groups, right? Our control group, which is a group of people who slept well, and then our experimental group, which is a group of people who did not sleep as long or as well. And we're testing them using the same materials, and we're seeing if there's a difference. And then from those results, we're either going to confirm, reject, or revise our theory, right? So confirming would be, we do see that people who had shortened night's sleep tested lower on that memory test. or we reject when we did not see a difference, or maybe the people who did sleep well tested lower, or we revise it because maybe it's not the length of the test or length of the sleep, maybe it's the quality of the sleep. So person who got an ample night's sleep may have slept longer, but their quality of sleep was less. Maybe they're a snorer, or maybe they have a lot of siblings, or there's a baby at the home that's crying all the time. So they could revise their hypothesis to say quality sleep boosts memory. And then they revise their research and observations to test that theory instead of just a general sleep boosts memory. We talked about case studies. Case studies suggest fruitful ideas for future research. We cannot generalize and we cannot obtain universal truth from case studies. You need a lot of statistical power, and that comes from having a lot of people or a lot of instances of data, like data points. And in a case study, you only have one, right? So you cannot generalize from that one case study, but you can pull ideas for future research. You now also have naturalistic observation. This often involves new technology. So the movement for big data, you'll have companies like Amazon or Facebook who are pulling massive amounts of data, just observing how people use their platforms. There's no control for this. So in say a regular qualitative study like the sleep example, you have a control group of people who got an ample amount of sleep. You can't control anything in a naturalistic observation. You are just watching. It does not explain behavior when we are doing a naturalistic observation. We don't know what's coming before and we don't know what's coming after. We can't survey people, right? We can't figure out if there's other contributing variables. We're going to define variables in a bit, but we cannot control any of those things. So we cannot explain, we cannot give a cause for what is happening. We can just describe and illuminate what's going on in the naturalistic behavior. So this is an example of a big data naturalistic behavior. This is tweets from Twitter, and it's the positive words and tweets going up and down, and then the time of the day. So we see that positive tweets are highest Saturday night going into like Sunday morning. And we see that they're their lowest on Tuesday afternoons. So we could theorize, we could say, oh, well, maybe the tweets are they're positive at late Saturday nights because people are out spending time with friends. Or we can say that, oh, well, tweets are lower during workday afternoons because people are traveling home from work and they're not on their phones. But while we can posit those ideas, we can't prove anything from this graph. This is just giving us data from what is happening. We cannot say this is what's causing it. We could run another study following people and their habits on Twitter to try to come up with an answer, but just with this graph, we cannot say what the reasons are for these trends. An ear for naturalistic observation. So psychologists Matthias Mell and James Pennenbacher have used electronically activated recorders to sample naturally occurring slices of daily life. So these recorders just sort of pick up little snippets of what's happening or what you might be hearing in day-to-day life. Again, there's no causal, you can't pull any causal information from this. You can't say why something is happening. It's just, this is what's happening. You have descriptive description in psychology or descriptive psychology, surveys and interviews. So you ask people to self-report their behavior or their opinions about a particular group. So in my research, I track people's opinions about toy brands. I also track their spending habits or their buying habits for a particular toy brand. So people are self-reporting what they feel, right? Their perceptions and what they do, their behavior, which is like how many toy brands they're buying in a given time frame. So the wording of your surveys will impact the responses that you get. Because if you word it in a way that's ambiguous, they might not understand what you are really trying to ask. So you might get data that's skewed one way or another because people did not understand or were interpreting in a different way, which is why it's really important to quality check your surveys and soft launch them to see if they're effective, not only in the wording, but if they're working correctly. So then sampling, making sure you have a rated, so there's a couple of ways, right? Representative sample, a random sample, or a population sample. So in my research, we have quotas for sampling where we're making sure we're getting a certain percentage of our sample coming from a particular age group, from a particular market, from a particular income bracket. So our quotas are like this massive Excel sheet, making sure we're getting a representative sample. That's not always possible, right? This is a survey that I work on that collects 15,000 respondents every 2 months, right? So we have a capacity for getting that representative sample. If you are doing a survey, say you only are trying to get 60 respondents or only have the capacity to get 60 respondents, you're probably not going to get a representative sample. So you get a random sample. And so you can't really control who is responding to your survey. You also want to think about the population in which you're pulling from, right? Are you pulling from a very specific group of people, or is it a wide group of people? Is it just people from a university, right? Because if you're only surveying people who are in college, you're only getting a very particular perspective. So understanding the population that you're sampling is important. Best basis for generalizing is from a representative sample. Okay, so you cannot represent. So for my work, if we did not have those quotas in place and we did not have a representative sample, then we would not be able to generalize the data that we have for the clients that we're working with. So we could not say this is a general response and like in brand awareness from the United States, right? Because if we didn't have a representative sample, we couldn't say that. Underrepresentative sample cannot be compensated by just adding more people. If you are missing a group of people, say you do not have enough people who come from a low income bracket, or you do not have enough people who are Native American, or you do not have enough people who identify as non-binary, and you need that for your sample, just adding more people and not specifically trying to get the group of people that you're missing will not make it up. We also have correlation, right? So this is a measure of the extent in which two factors vary together, how they're related. Usually explains only part of a variation among individuals and uncovers naturally occurring relationships, right? How things are pairing together. How does this thing impact this thing? So when we're talking about that in a statistical sense, we have the correlation coefficient. It's a statistical index for the relationship between two things. So a positive correlation is greater than 0 to 1, positive 1, which indicates a direct relationship. So as one thing increases, the other increases, right? So as time increases, height increases, or a negative correlation, which is below 0 to -1, and indicates an inverse relationship. As one increases, the other decreases, and vice versa. So positive correlation, you'll see a line. A negative correlation, you'll see an X, right? So correlation does not prove causation. Just because there is a relationship does not mean this thing causes this thing. Correlation suggests a possible cause-effect relationship, does not prove it. So remember this principle, and you will be wiser as you read and hear scientific news. An example, and I don't know if I have it in here. Okay, down. So one really good example of correlation does not equal causation. In the summertime, as temperatures rise, we see a positive correlation with the number of homicides in an area. Oh, sorry. As ice cream sales increase, we see a increase in the number of homicides in an area. And it would be silly to say ice cream sales are causing homicides, right? So while that's a correlation, that's not a causal relationship. And we can't necessarily prove another causal relationship because of this, but we could hypothesize that maybe it's not the ice cream sales, maybe it's the temperature, right? Because ice cream sales are impacted by temperature. You're selling more ice cream when it's hot, like in the summer, and people are more agitated when they're hot, right? When it's really hot outside. So we might see an increase in violent crime. So just because something is related does not mean it's causal. And that's super important to remember when you're hearing information, especially on the news, because that seems to be a something that people who distribute news do not grasp fully. Just because it's a causal relationship does not mean, or a correlation relationship does not mean it causes that thing to happen. So experimentation. Experiments enable researchers to isolate the effects of one or more factors, right? So we can manipulate the factor of interest and determine its effect, and we can hold constants or controls of other factors. So you can, in an experimental state, right, you can look at this thing that you're interested in and control all of the other things outside of that. So you can have different groups in a study, right? You can have experimental group. This is the group that receives the treatment or the thing that you're trying to look at. Then you have the control group, does not receive anything, right? They're just the control, the standard, right? You have random sampling that can create a representative survey sample, and you can have random assignment that can equalize experimental and control groups. Really important to randomly assign people to their groups so you don't have a sort of a, I can't remember the name of the particular bias, but it's where the person, if they know they're in the experimental group, they will act a certain way because they believe they are receiving the experimental treatment, right? This is similar to like the placebo effect. If someone believes they're experiencing or receiving a medication, they will experience the effects of that medication because they believe they're taking it. So we want to make sure not only is it randomized, but it's double blind, meaning that the participants do not know what group they're in and the researchers do not know what group they're in, so that the researchers don't impact or have a bias in the way that they are collecting their information. Oh, right here, double blind procedure, where I just explained the experimental procedure in which the researcher and the participant do not know what group they are placed in, whether that's treatment or control or placebo, and then the placebo effect where people believe, right, they will experience behaviors or emotions or what have you based on the fact that they believe they received the experimental treatment. We then have variables. So I think I've said variables once or twice before as we've been explaining the scientific method. And these are really important to understand when you're trying to figure out what type of study is happening or what type of analysis needs to be used. So the independent variable is in an experiment is manipulated. Its effect is being studied. So this independent variable is being changed. It is independent of all the other variables. It's the one that's being fluctuated. Confounding variable is a factor that might influence the study result. It might be something that you can't account for. Maybe it's something like participants' diet, exercise, sleep hygiene, caffeine intake, right? Maybe something that you can't necessarily control that could, impact your study. The dependent variable is what happens. It's the outcome that is measured. It may change when the independent variable is manipulated. So independent variable is the one we are changing, right? And we're fluctuating. It's independent of all these other variables. The dependent variable depends on what happens to that independent variable. What happens to that depends on what's being manipulated. So we have this picture right here. It's a random assignment controlling for confounding variables such as parental intelligence and environment. So we have these two groups, our experimental and control. We have our independent variable, which is a experimental group that receives breast milk. And then we have a control group that receives the formula. And our dependent variable is an intelligence score that the child will take at the age of 8. So that score depends on that independent variable, which is whether or not the child received breast milk or formula. And then we have those two groups. And there could be many confounding variables happening in this study because maybe, yes, as an infant and as a baby, they were separated by those independent variables, breast milk and formula. But then after they started eating solid foods, the diets of these kids could be vastly different, right? You could have, if the idea is that breast milk can make intelligence scores higher, right? You could have children who were breastfed or had breast milk, but then once they started eating solid foods, they were only eating like chicken nuggets and French fries and ketchup and Diet Dr. Pepper, right? Up until they took this intelligence test at 8. And then you have these other children who took formula, but then after they started eating solid foods, they were eating a very balanced diet of fruit and vegetables and meats and things that promote brain plasticity and were being very stimulated in their environments. So there are a lot of confounding factors that could really impact these intelligence scores, especially if they're having them take this test when they're 8 years old, so long after children stop either being breastfed or having formula. So how do you know which research design to use? So number one, you need to make sure you have a testable question, right? Remember when we were talking about hypotheses, they have to be testable. Whatever you're trying to figure out, you have to be able to test it. And then you have to identify a method that's appropriate, or research design that's appropriate to test it, right? Can you make an experiment with this? Is it ethical to make an experiment with this? Will it be correlational, right? Are you able to control enough of the confounding variables to create a cause and effect relationship and make it replicable? Is this just a case study? Is this something that logistically cannot be remade or that ethically cannot be remade, and you only have this one example where it happened and you have to study that. You just need to observe what happens in nature, right? Is this something where you just need to observe and describe behavior? Is this a twin study, which I remember I talked about in the um, previous chapter 1 lecture, where we were talking about evolutionary psychology. And we talked about how twins who may have been separated and raised in different environments, but have the same genetic makeup. Is it that kind of study where you need to see, is this a genetic factor or is this an environmental factor? Is this a study that needs to be done longitudinally, right? So that example we had with breast milk and having a test at 8, the genuine design of the study would really need to be longitudinal. You need to track these infants from birth until 8 years old. You need to be taking into account their diets, their exercise, their stimulation, what kind of schools they go to. And those are really hard to fund and really hard to keep up with, especially if you're trying to track children or people. People will drop out of the study because they move or something happens, or a cross-sectional study. So you need to also, after you identify your research design, you need to find how you're going to measure what you're trying to look at. How are you measuring the behavior? How are you measuring the mental process? Which also depends on how you are defining what you're looking at. And then how are you going to interpret the results? And we're not going to be going very heavily into different types of research or different types of statistical analyses. If you go further into a psychological career or you major in psychology in college, you will talk more about these in stats, where stats 1 and stats 2, where we go everything from t-tests to ANOVAs. Predicting everyday behavior. So experiments test theoretical principles. The resulting principles, rather than any specific finding, help explain everyday behaviors. So the thing about research is, especially if you're doing experiments, I like to think of experiments and research being done in sort of the ivory academic tower, right? They might work up there, does not necessarily mean it works in everyday practice. But you can take the principles, the general ideas you're learning from these studies and apply it to that everyday life and that everyday behavior. So psychological science focuses less on interpreting specific behaviors and more so relying on the general principles to help us explain a wide variety of behaviors. So let's talk about ethics in research, which I've mentioned multiple times throughout this chapter, but it's one of the really most important things we learn about in Gen Psych, among other things, but understanding how we can conduct this research ethically, right? So number 1, protecting animal research participants. Well, number 1, why do we study animals? To understand species differences and similarities and to investigate treatments for human diseases and to use them in psychological, biological, and medical research. Animal studies, especially in psychological and medical research, is tricky, right? But if it wasn't for animal research, we would not have the cures for diseases like polio, right? So it's a balance of making sure that these animals are being treated ethically and understanding the need for being able to use animals in research, because we can't test medications, especially experimental medications, directly on humans. Excuse me, right? And we can learn a lot from animals when we're talking about psychological research, and not so much the medical side, but the behavioral side. There's a lot we can learn from animals and how they interact with their environments. But we want to make sure we're protecting them. So we have many different guidelines and standards for how we interact with animals, and specific safeguards that have to be in place to make sure they're being protected and their well-being is made a priority. Some of those guidelines include the British Psychological Association or Society's guidelines, American Psychological Association, European Parliament of Standards, and university ethics committees. So anytime you have a study, especially one that's being done in a university setting, there is a very intense IRB process, and any procedures and methods that animals are being used have a very stringent review of what exactly is being done. Is it necessary? And how is it going to be done with the well-being of the animals at the forefront? We also need to think about protecting human research and human participants. So we have, again, the ethics code for APA and Britain's BPS. So we first must contain participants' informed consent before they participate in any study. So in the past, right, especially in experiments and studies done from the 20s to the 60s, fully informed consent was not clearly defined. So a lot of people were participating in studies where they did not know what was going to be happening to them to the fullest extent. So making sure that participants know what is happening in the study. And then even if they, at the very beginning, don't know exactly what's happening, they're fully debriefed at the end, where they know exactly what was going to be happening or what their data is going to be used for. Protecting participants from greater than usual harm and discomfort. So our studies cannot put people in grave danger or bodily harm, right? Or extreme psychological distress. If for any reason it is, or something is being studied that is uncomfortable, there's a lot of safeguards set in place to make sure that, one, it's necessary, two, how are those participants being cared for and compensated afterwards, and three, how are they being informed that they are taking place in a study that may be harmful. Next is keeping information of individual participants confidential. And this is really, really important especially depending on what kind of research you're doing. So I, as well as Dr. Anderson, some of our background is in sexual health and sexual risk reduction research, where we would, some of our studies would be asking participants to disclose their sexual behaviors. And if that research was to get out and their answers were attached to them, right, you could identify who they were through their answers, that is a huge breach of trust and a violation of confidentiality, and could lead to distress and harm to those participants. So we had to make sure that any data that we collected was completely anonymous and de-identified. And then, like I said, fully debriefing people and explain the research afterwards, making sure they are fully caught up on what happened and what the research is being used for, and informed if there was any temporary deception. So a person should never leave a research situation, right, without being debriefed on what happened. And then, of course, there's the University Ethics Committee guidelines. So we also need to take into account a researcher's values, right? The influence, topic choices, if their values are going to color their observations and their interpretations of the results, and if they have any hidden biases or unconscious biases. So this part is how you can use psychology to become a better or stronger person and a better student, right? The thing I really love about teaching psychology and what I hope that you can get out of this class is there are things that you can take from us in this class and this content and apply it directly to your own life to help you live a better life. So some evidence-based suggestions for living a better life in not only psychological science, but in medical science are to get a full night's sleep, which has, I know, high school students and then potentially college students, if you choose to continue your academic careers, is really hard to prioritize, but it is one of the most important things to make sure you are living a healthy life. And if you are not getting a full night's sleep, it can really impact your cognitive abilities. It impacts your weight, your circadian rhythm, which is your natural sleep cycle. It impacts your heart health. There's so many things. And I believe one of this articles we're going to be going over in class is a sleep article to show you how important it is to get a full night's sleep. Exercising, which does not mean like you're hitting the gym 2 hours a day every day. It's like taking a walk. If you become college students and you're walking across campus with your heavy backpacks, right, that counts as exercise. Setting long-term goals, right, having a goal-oriented life can help you feel fulfilled. Having a growth mindset, believing that you have the ability to change, even if you're not great at something, if you have the ability to grow into those skills, is super important. And then also prioritizing your relationships, right? Whether those be with family, friends, animals, right? Significant partners, being able to set those relationships as a priority in your life is important to your overall well-being. So for becoming a better student, right? Some evidence-based, right? These are psychological studies, evidence-based suggestions for learning and retaining information. Number one is self-testing and rehearsal. So there's the testing effect, retrieval practice effect, and test enhanced learning. And we're going to talk about all those in our memory and learning chapter, which I believe is chapter 7. So you do this in this class by using Achieve, right? Remember in the introduction video, I said that it was adaptive. So the way Achieve works is it's through test questions and it changes, right, depending on what you're doing well and what you're not doing well in, right? So if you're doing well in a particular concept, it will stop asking you those questions and focus on the questions that you aren't doing so well in. So you're getting that testing effect. SQ3R study method, which is survey, question, read, retrieve, and review, right? So that's going through all of the content, right? Reading through it, asking questions, reading through it again, trying to retrieve the information without reading it. So like closing your book and trying to answer questions and then reviewing the material. Additional study tips, and again, these are evidence-based. Distribute your study time, right? Don't cram. Cramming is some of the worst study practices that you can have. I know sometimes I'm very well aware that I'm very aware that sometimes it's necessary. But if you have the capability to do so, spread it out, right? Do like 30 minutes a day or an hour every other day studying a particular concept, and it will help you encode and truly remember that information. Learning to think critically. Remember, I said that critical thinking is not innate. It's not something that we naturally can do. We have to learn how to do it. Process class information actively. So you're not just reading your notes, right? You're quizzing yourself. You're going through the Achieve platform. You're doing flashcards, right? You're asking yourself questions. You're teaching someone else. That's one of the best methods for learning information is taking what you learned and teach it to a family member or a friend or talking through and teaching another student in the class. And then overlearn, right? Go really in depth in material, especially if you find it interesting, and overlearn it. And you'll remember what is important. Okay, so that is, I'm gonna stop sharing. That is the end of chapter 1. So we remember this is in 2 parts. So you need to have watched chapter 1 and then chapter 1, lecture 1, and then this is going to be chapter 1, lecture 2. I also suggest following along with the handout and the outline. So the outline gives you like a overall view of the content. The handout is a little more in detailed, and you can use that to follow along with the videos. Again, remember that your Achieve assignments are going to be due on Friday. That includes the intro survey and the orientation activity. You also have the chapter 1 assignments along with the chapter 1 quiz due on Achieve on Friday. Your chapter 1 discussion board post, your initial post is due on Wednesday, and then your post to a friend's or a classmate's discussion board is due on Friday. You have to watch both of these videos, and you also have to watch parts of a journal article. The parts of a journal article is going to be done by another instructor, Janie Trentham. She's wonderful. She explains that content really, really well. So I highly recommend watching that video, going through the handout. And I will also be making an announcement regarding that information. But that is going to be really important to help you through our first assignment, which is going to be the Consumer of Psychological Science assignment, which will be coming up in a couple weeks. So make sure you're watching or checking the course calendar. You're watching all of the content that's assigned for this week. Again, please feel free to email me if you have any questions.